at least one official language within a short time of arrival, and their children usually grow up bilingual, speaking just like native Canadians of their age and social strata. This is very interesting research done by Professor Chambers from the University of Toronto. So just to sum up, I think it's not surprising that rather than language, it's our culture alone that makes a noticeable contribution to Canada as a multi-ethnic and multilingual country. Thank you.
There's a lot of shared opinion as to what is important, and one might otherwise not have thought that that's the case. I mean, the fact that there's both that the separate groups of immigrants see culture as the fundamental value is an important factor, I think, for us for the future, because we tend to dwell on the differences between between our parents' generation, for example, and us, and how we approach things. So, thanks very much. That's very interesting. I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind elaborating on that particular point, and seeing how different the other results were in terms of the responses, but the similarity there.
Does it work? No. Like I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, this is a byproduct of my linguistic research. However, to me, it was so interesting that I decided to write an article about it. And what I can tell you is that we are not the only minority group in Canada that sort of value culture most, because there is a study done by a few professors, one of them is from your university, about Italo-Canadians. What they value is the same group of values, which is language, culture, and religion. However, there is no study that says clearly, okay, this is culture we value most. And there is no study for the Polish community that would say that. However, I think that it depends. How you stratify the values depends on what you have on your list of values. Because if you go beyond European groups, you have, for example, and I have it in my article, for Tamil communities, their markers of identity is, listen carefully, dietary habits, the use of traditional clothes, celebration of Indian festivals, lifestyle, and the choice of marriage partner. None of them apply to us. So I think that this is quite, I would say, vague. So for us it will be culture, for many European groups as well, but for groups from outside, yeah. You can understand.
The part I want to talk to you about, and I know Jason Kenny was here yesterday, so I apologize if I repeat anything from his presentation, but I want to give you just a broad overview of what's going on from the government side, and talk to you a bit about multiculturalism, and then transition to something that we call pluralism coming out of the government, and then what that practically means for the Polish diaspora here in Canada. I'm going to start at 10,000 feet and try and end up on the ground. Multiculturalism is something that came up in your presentation, and it's a value that Canadians hold near and dear to their heart. When you survey or focus group Canadians, and ask them what are some intrinsic values that Canadians hold, multiculturalism always comes up. But when you poke at that and you try to get to the bottom of what their conception of multiculturalism is, it's a bit dated. Without going into too much of a historical lesson here on multiculturalism, it actually starts in the linguistic world with French and English, minority language rights, and that's kind of the history where it comes from. And it evolves with your own community being one of the first communities to settle in Canada, along with the Ukrainian community in Western Canada, and then other waves of immigration. And multiculturalism evolves through that history. You move from celebrating differences from respecting differences to celebrating differences. Sort of a really interesting juncture right now We've had waves of non-European immigration through the 70s. The face of Canada has changed quite significantly, just right here on this panel. The fact that we're at a Polish diaspora conference shows that the face of Canada is changing. But what does that mean practically? Has multiculturalism shifted to deal with that new face of Canada? And I'm going to propose to you that it actually hasn't. The very idea of multiculturalism talks about the fact that we all exist. Okay, the fact that we're here, 3 of us, is enough for multiculturalism. We never have to speak to each other. We can go on living our own lives, speaking our own languages at home, having separate identities, as long as we respect the fact that you exist, you have the same rights and laws that apply to me. Multiculturalism works. And that was very important for the society Canada was created to deal with at the time. Minority languages, new waves of European immigration, and so on. The juncture we're at right now is a question: is this the society we want, and is this the society that actually is the best case scenario? You'll hear from the government and from the Prime Minister and ministers this term being thrown around called pluralism. And you'll read in the paper that this is just a conservative rebrand of multiculturalism that the Liberal Party had. And I apologize to my American friends out here, but I'm going to speak in Canadian politics for a bit. You'll hear that this is just a rebrand, and I'm going to pose to you that it actually isn't. The idea of pluralism, which is now being discussed in academia, but also at the political level and in civil service, is the idea that we can't just coexist. That's not enough for society. We really do have to start talking about active engagement. And this is where you see multiculturalism actually changing in its history, from funding language programs to funding cultural dance and festivals and such. What we're seeing now is it's funding that interaction, which is very, very important as we go forward and we see new waves of immigration. So why is this important? Canada, again, is at a juncture. We have, and I'm not going to sugarcoat this for you, we've become a place where folks settle for many reasons. One, for a better economic life, to help their children have a better life than them, but also to run from persecution and such. And what we're seeing in multiculturalism is that it's not ready to cope with that issue, and I'll be quite specific. Issues such as minority politics here in Canada. We see issues like the Sri Lankan dispute being exerted on the streets of Toronto and Ottawa and the such. And multiculturalism will allow for this. When folks break very basic Canadian laws on our streets, the value of multiculturalism that we really don't understand is always the card that is played. So it's becoming more politically correct to talk about this term integration. Americans in the room have heard integration in this in this debate for generations. This is actually new for us to actually use that term. It's considered a dirty term in politics. If you go back and look through debates in the House of Commons, the term integration was never used in the history of this country, and it's quite interesting. So the debate now that's happening is about pluralism and how do we actively engage each other in a meaningful way. So I'll shift to the politics side here. I'm more interested in your questions than hearing myself talk, but what does this mean practically in politics? Again, if you read what the newspaper says, political parties are segmenting populations and saying, okay, you're Polish. We're going to drop visas for Polish citizens to come to Canada, and therefore you will vote for the government. Or we'll do symbolic statements in the House of Commons, and that will open you to this party. This part of that is true. There is an idea that people self-select themselves and organize them, as the previous presentation showed. But I think it's a very simplistic way to look at things, because I think the second generation of diasporas are becoming more interested in integrating into society than their parents' generation. I see that in my own community, I see that in the Italian community, I see that in a lot of the communities. So the question then for the political world to understand you better is, what are your values? What are the second generation's values? And those are usually more mainstream Canadian values. So I really get frustrated with the newspaper, the Globe and the Star, that continuously runs a story that diasporas are very, very simplistic, that you can buy a vote with one issue. I think, more broadly speaking, it's very important for communities like your community, my community, and others to be part of a greater understanding of what you want in your politics and from your government. Not on very community-oriented issues. Those are very important for maintaining culture, maintaining language, but also becoming more engaged in the mainstream life. I think the Polish Congress, Canada, was one of the first organizations to say we don't want an internship program at Parliament. We want to integrate ourselves into the mainstream internship program. That's to say that our community is better off aligning ourselves with mainstream institutions for both our community's sake, but also the betterment of this country. So I think as you go forward in the work you guys do in groups and then into the mainstream diaspora organizations, don't lose sight of the overall Canadian narrative here. It's very important that those two paths align. I'm just going to...
I think I have a great testimony of how to incorporate Italian language into making a great business. I am about as hardcore Italian as you're going to get. My mother and father were born in Italy, grew up in Italy, met here actually in Canada, believe it or not, and married in 1961. I came along in 62. What's interesting is I grew up in a home, first of 3 boys. My mother and father spoke Italian. I responded in English. It was very interesting dynamics. As we grew up, we always had my parents speak to us in Italian, and we always responded in English. When I finished school and went into industry, I was led to be in charge of about 20 immigrant Italians, and they spoke basically Italian. So it was a unique position to really grasp my Italian language. But what it did, it led me to a position of increased power, because being able to speak 2 languages. It led me to leaders of industry, a bridge between languages, but also gave me an opportunity to increase my prominence between different levels of people, between seniors and younger people. And it was very interesting. But I wanted to share with you the Canadian Italian Business Professional Association and what we have done. And I think I can give you some good insight as far as how you can see through first generation, well, the immigrant generation, the first generation, and my experiences with the American federations, 3, 4, 5 generations. And the growth and the interesting changes to political, to industry, and to business. Some of the challenges that we do share, and I'll get into that later, is becoming 2nd and 3rd generation Canadian. The loss of language, the busyness of society, the constraints and trying to work and teach your children some of the aspects of your culture. And I'm living proof of that, because my children, it's a challenge every day to share some of our culture and to ingrain our language. And how do we best do that in a consistent manner? Because ultimately, in the end, I am very concerned about the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th generation Canadian losing their Polish language, their Polish culture, and of course my love the Italian culture. Preserving the culture is becoming more difficult and distancing from the origins. But there's some of the historical background. Most Italians came to Canada post-World War I and post-World War II. My parents post-World War II, of course. Like many immigrants, they came to Canada, very little money, but some great ambition and great drive to make a better life, like many Polish people. What's interesting is the Italian community has engaged themselves into the capitalistic society that we live in, and have done a very good job at it. And what I want to share with you is, by ingraining themselves in all fabrics of society, we've become a powerful force in Canada. And what's interesting is I see some of those same dynamics in this room today. I see young, vibrant Polish teens to 30 age that can be a prominent factor. I think what I'd like to do is share with you some insight as how you can make a great impact into Canadian culture, European culture,